So good evening, everybody. My name is Corinne Goodwin. I'm Executive Director of Eastern Pennsylvania Trans Equity Project. We're really glad to have you all here this evening for this Trans Topics Advocacy Academy workshop, where we're going to be talking about anti-LGBTQ legislation and the legislative process. We're really glad you could be here. We hope you join us for future events. As a reminder, you will be able to view this as well as other past events and workshops on the Eastern PA Trans Equity Project YouTube channel. We have muted everybody's audio tonight just to make sure that everybody has some privacy, but you will be able to watch the recording at a later time. We do also hope that you'll be able to join us for our next Advocacy Academy workshop, which will be on September 20th, which is called Yes, You Too Can Become an LGBTQ Advocate. And we hope that you'll be able to make it for that one. Okay, so let's kind of move on. And I want to make sure that everybody knows that we are, got to give you the little disclaimer here, but Eastern Pennsylvania Trans Equity Project, we do not directly or indirectly participate in, intervene in, any political campaign on behalf or in opposition to any candidate for elective office. That is a requirement of the federal government, as we are a nonprofit 501c3 corporation. We don't make any contributions to political campaigns or funds, nor do we make any statements in favor or opposition to any particular candidate for public office. The purpose of this presentation is to educate the public, that is you, on issues that impact the LGBTQ community and in particular the transgender community, and to help members of the public such as yourselves understand matters that are of concern to you. So that is now, the disclaimer is out of the way. We can talk a little bit about what we're going to get done tonight. We have a lot to cover in a reasonably short amount of time. We're going to start off with just a little bit of a recap on the current state. We're going to talk about some polling. And then we're going to move on into what's going on with anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation around the country. And then on top of that, we're going to talk a little bit about the facts. So how do we back up our case with legislators to try to prevent this stuff from getting passed? And then we're going to end up with talking about some strategy and tactics. So I'm really glad that you could all be here this evening. So let's start off just talking really briefly about the landscape. So Human Rights Campaign, in conjunction with the HEART organization, did a bunch of polling over the last couple of years around the political landscape. And one of the things they found is that 67% of all Americans oppose legislation that would prohibit transgender youth from participating in sports according to the gender that they identify with. It's a pretty interesting finding when you think about what's going on around the country today. They also found that 66%, so essentially the same plurality of Americans, oppose legislation that would prohibit affirming medical care for transgender youth. Then they did another poll around the same time where they specifically reached out to Trump voters in 10 swing states. That includes our state of Pennsylvania, where I am, and asked them a bunch of questions around transgender and LGBTQ issues. And 60% of people who voted for Donald Trump in the last election said that trans people should be able to live openly and freely. And then when they were asked about how they prioritize the importance of transgender people participating in sports in particular, compared to other policy issues, this issue came in dead last. It was a universe of 10 questions that they asked, and only 1 to 3%, depending on the state, said that this was a high priority issue. So if you think about all the noise that's going on over the last really year to 2 years around transgender people and youth in particular participating in sports, the truth is that when you look at Trump voters, so these are people that you would think are probably pretty conservative, pretty energized group of people on the right side of the political spectrum, that only 3% at max really view transgender issues and LGBTQ issues more broadly as a real issue. So we really have to, begin to ask ourselves, what's going on and why have over 289 anti-LGBTQ bills been introduced across the country. Of those, 46 have passed. And they really are focusing on transgender people in particular, but more broadly, LGBTQ inclusive issues as well, with things like, the Don't Say Gay bills that we're hearing about, right? So they are targeting healthcare, they're targeting athletics, and then thirdly, they're targeting education. But one thing I just want to kind of get out of the way really early is that, you can look at this 289 number and get a little bit freaked out because there's so many bills that have been put out there, but only 46 of them have been passed. And many of those have actually been vetoed. So their success rate is only 16%. Another way to look at it is if you were a baseball player and your batting average was at 84% or 840, you'd be the richest man in the country, right? So we are actually doing a pretty good job of stopping this stuff. We want to do a better job, obviously. We want to make sure that this stuff never gets introduced. But it's important for us to recognize the fact that, whether it's organizations like ours or the ACLU or TILDEF, the Trans Law Center, all of these organizations are working really, really hard to stop this stuff. And we're making a successful opportunity. We're doing it successfully for the most part. So why would politicians choose to target an already vulnerable population of LGBTQ people? Well, the answer is really simple. It activates the political base. So on the right, on the Republican side of the equation, it absolutely activates their base of voters, in particular evangelical Christian voters. But the other thing it does is it moves Democrats and moderates across the line to vote and to give money to Republican candidates. So it's a really interesting dynamic that we're seeing here is that the number one issue, far and away, that'll make a moderate or a non-aligned person vote for a right-leaning candidate is concerns around transgender issues. So they know that this thing works, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So I want to give you just a little bit of history here moving forward here, and we're going to really go back to the late 60s, early 70s, and the 20th century. So some of us are old enough to remember Anita Bryant and all of the work that she did around what they called Save the Children, which was, Save Our Children, which was an organization set up and led by Anita Bryant as their spokesperson to avoid having non-discrimination ordinances, first in Miami, but then really all across the country. And as an outgrowth of that movement, the Alliance Defending Freedom was formed. So the ADF is I shouldn't say registered hate organization, but it is acknowledged as being a hate organization, a hate group, founded by 35 Christian leaders, evangelical Christian leaders, back in 1993. And they really are at the heart and soul of everything that's going on right now in the universe here when it comes to anti-LGBTQ legislation. So they're actually part of a large ecosystem. So there's the Family Policy Alliance, Focus on the Family, the Family Policy Institute, the FRC or Family Research Council. These are all evangelical Christian-led organizations, and their mantra really is around the idea that society is being degraded by LGBTQ people, and more broadly around things like immigration and people who aren't Christians being brought into the United States. And all of this really coalesces in their view in the problem of us not being able to reach the quote unquote kingdom of heaven. So these are really powerful organizations. They're very influential organizations, and they really have a lot of sway with certain parts of the political spectrum. So these people, it's really important to remember that they are part of really this Christian nationalist type worldview. And it isn't just us as LGBTQ people that they are going after, but it's really many other populations as well. we're just sort of the tip of the spear, if you want to think of it in that sense. They really have an outsized level of influence. So evangelical voters as a whole make up 15% of the United States population. They're really one of the largest true blocks of voters within the US population. And they're really, really activated. They're very active. So while they're 15% of the population, they make up 28% of the voting populace, right? So they vote at a higher rate than really any other organized group, higher rate than LGBTQ people, a higher rate than people of color, a higher rate than immigrants, a higher rate of virtually any other group. And 76% of them vote Republican. Their issues are anti-LGBTQ, anti-abortion, anti-immigrant, this really kind of Christian nationalist worldview. And these numbers, by the way, come from an Associated Press research survey that was done about a year ago, or a couple of years ago, rather. And they've really made a bunch of alliances. So they've made alliances with the Heritage Foundation primarily, but also with the Cato Institute and Koch and, Koch and some of these other organizations, right? And for these organizations, their piece that they're interested in, the truth is that for the most part, they could care less about LGBTQ issues. They could care less about abortion issues, and they could care less about immigration issues. They are focused on pro-corporate, anti-healthcare, anti-regulation, anti-voter, and anti-socialist issues. So they are all about how do we help the corporate America get ahead and be successful. They believe strongly in laissez-faire capitalism, and they know that in order to get their piece across the line, to get their anti-climate change viewpoints going through in Congress, for example, or to control voter registration or to control corporate regulations, they know that in order to get that agenda across the line, that they need the evangelicals to ensure that they are voting. Because the Republican Party, which traditionally is the party that supports these organizations' worldview, is actually losing voters nationally. And as the country gets, frankly, browner and speaks Spanish and other languages more fluently, they know that they have to activate these other organizations of voters that support these other organizations. And the number one, frankly, is evangelical Christian organizations. They know that culture wars, which is what we are in the middle of, is really good for politics. And I also want to pause here for a second, because the fact of the matter is that Democrats also know that culture wars are good for politics. Excuse me. So, these issues, and I think that many of us, we sit around and we watch the evening news or we're reading online and we go like, why are they talking about LGBTQ kids in schools or transgender issues or healthcare for trans people when we really want our politicians to be fixing healthcare for everybody, or we want them to be working on bringing down inflation, or we want them to be working on improving our national defense, or whatever these other issues are that really are broader and more important nationally, climate change, right? We want them working on those things, but both parties, Republicans and Democrats, both leverage the culture war for their own benefit. And so it's important that we understand that going in. This isn't just a Republican problem, it's a Democrat problem as well. So some really digging back in the history a little bit, relatively recent history. So 2014, 2015, right before the Obergefell ruling that legalized gay marriage, our movement, the LGBTQ movement, was really, really fighting for relevance and frankly for our survival. And it wasn't just us that was fighting for survival. It was also all those organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, that were also fighting for relevance and survival. They could see the writing on the wall that gay marriage was going to happen, right? That more and more and more Americans were getting out there and being in favor of gay marriage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the back part of this presentation. But frankly, they knew that they were losing relevance, and they knew that they had to be able to find a way to survive. So if you no longer could make your position as being anti-gay, specifically anti-gay marriage, your main talking point, that means that you're no longer going to get donations to your organization. You're no longer going to be able to leverage contributions. And so they would go out of business. So they knew that they had to find other issues to activate their base on. And they really decided that the issue they wanted to stand on was transgender young people, and specifically around restrooms. So in 2014, the Alliance Defending Freedom created this student physical privacy policy. It was a white paper that they issued, and they sent out to all of the legislators in the states, and particularly on the right. And what they really said is that they, as an organization, specifically were offering to publicly defend schools in court that would prohibit transgender students from using a bathroom or locker room that aligned with their identity. And the test case for them was the Gloucester County Public Schools. So that is a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court here not too long ago with Gavin Grimm, if anybody knows who Gavin Grimm was, or is rather, right? And so that was the test case for them. And it frankly took until just this past year for it to be largely resolved. In 2015, the ADF created this draft legislation called the Student Physical Privacy Act. And what they did is they said that they would place a bounty of $2,500 on any transgender student that was outed using a restroom that aligned with their identity, right? And the idea being that, you know, anybody who outed that student could sue in court through what's called a private action, and that would allow that student or that plaintiff to recover $2,500 from the school system every time they encountered a transgender student in quote unquote the wrong facility, right? And if this looks familiar to you, it's because it's the same type of action that they are taking, or that they recently took in Texas around their abortion law, right? So what they're saying is that any private citizen, any student, anytime that you encountered a transgender student, maybe like myself, in a restroom, every single time that happened, you could get $2,500, and they would help you sue that school system to get that money back. So this right of private action is something that we're starting to see spread. So remember I mentioned that we are the tip of the spear. This is starting to spread to other aspects of American society. They brought this law and they took it to Nevada, they took it to Kentucky, they took it to Minnesota, and they took it to Texas. And in every case, the law was either defeated outright, or it was withdrawn in the case of Texas. All right. So what they discovered is that at that time, America wasn't right for this type of law. And so they do what any type of general does, is they shifted the battlefield. So I mentioned Obergefell a few minutes ago. So in Obergefell, gay marriage was affirmed. They lit up the White House in rainbow colors. And frankly, what happened is a lot of LGBTQ organizations, they just really kind of sat back and took a breath and kind of said, wow, you know, we were successful, we've arrived. And what many LGBT organizations did is they took their foot off the pedal and tried to make a difference here in terms of just, you know, being supportive versus being advocates. And this is where we kind of came off base here a little bit, and the other side did not. So in 2015, they introduced something in Houston, Texas called HERO, or the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. This was a ordinance that was passed by city council. It passed 11-6, and polls showed that 70% of voters supported this ordinance that would make discrimination on sexual orientation, gender identity, sex, race, color, ethnicity, national origin, and all the other categories illegal, right? In terms of housing, public employment, private employment, city contracting, but religious organizations would be exempt from it. Organizations, including the ADF and some of those other ones that we just mentioned, they were really pissed off that this thing went through, and they sued under the charter for the city of Houston for a referendum, and they won the right to have a referendum. That referendum lost 61% to 39%. So support for the act went from 70% down to just under 40%. It swung 30% within 3 weeks. And the reason why it swung is because they started running these horrible commercials on TV showing this cute little girl that you see here on the screen going into a restroom and then being followed into that restroom by a scary man, not a trans person, a scary man. And they were talking about trans men going into women's rooms, and that this law would allow that to happen, which of course we know really doesn't happen. But it was a scary thing. So they swung this election within 3 weeks by 30%, and they won and we lost. And so that got them pretty excited. In 2016, HB2 came in North Carolina, and remember, they thought they had found the secret sauce around bathrooms and bathroom access. So North Carolina, they introduced HB2, which was a law that said that transgender people wouldn't be able to use public facilities in schools and museums and public buildings. We wouldn't be able to use the restrooms that went with our identified sex, right? We would have to use a restroom that's listed on our birth certificate. The other thing it did is it said that local cities, so for example, the city of Charlotte, that had an anti-discrimination ordinance in effect, that law was null and void. So if you recall back that long ago, seems like forever, but it's really only been about 6 years, is that, it went crazy, right? There were videos on TV, and the NCAA canceled all kinds of games. The NBA canceled the All-Star game. The federal government and other states said that they wouldn't allow their employees to travel to North Carolina for conferences. Within 1 year, North Carolina lost $600 million in tax revenue, in revenue in general for the economy. And that's a big number. And just within a year later, they had their general election, and their governor lost re-election. And it showed that the reason why is because of this particular bill. What happened is trans people started telling their stories, right? So we've got, this photo of this trans man in his cowboy hat, and he's in the ladies' room and saying, like, is this really where you think I need to be? We had just a huge amount of leverage happening and people telling their stories. And the moral of the story is that our visibility and the empathy that we get from telling our stories made the difference. And frankly, what happened is that all these organizations backed off on bathroom bills. Then came 2019, so a few years later. And in Kentucky, the Republicans were running a really, really weak candidate, a candidate that they knew was going to lose for the gubernatorial race. And so they took this as an opportunity to do a lot of message testing. And an organization called the American Principles Project, they did a bunch of testing. And one of the things that they tested on was talking about transgender kids in sports and how that was unfair to cisgender women. And what they found is in the time that they started that ad campaign to the end of the election, that swung the race by 7%. Their guy still lost, right? He lost by 9%, but before they started running these ads, he was losing by 16%. And so you get a 7% change in a race. That is huge. You think about swing districts. So the district where I reside is considered one of the 2 or 3 most competitive in the country. It could swing either Republican or Democrat. And remember that if you can run that race by 7%, you can win. Well, we talked about that 3% who are highly activated by this issue. That is enough to swing an election in a close race. So what the APP did is they went out and started shopping this research, and they shopped it first to the Alliance Defending Freedom, and then they shopped it to Heritage. And Heritage really took this and said, wow, if we can move a congressional race by 7%, or a gubernatorial race by 7%, or a competitive state house or Senate race by 7%, we want some of that juice. So for Heritage, it's not about trans folk. It's about moving voters. And Heritage has got a big bankroll. Their bankroll makes the ADF look like nothing. So they start pushing on this button of anti-trans sports legislation. And the first bill that was passed in the country was in 2020 in Idaho. So they called it the Fairness in Women's Sports Act. So this was passed just a little under 2 years ago. And it specifically banned transgender girls from participating in school sports from kindergarten through college. So 5-year-olds who just want to kick a soccer ball around with their friends, 8-year-olds who want to participate, on a school intramural team, 10-year-olds, right? None of them were allowed to, would not have been allowed to participate on a girls' team, for example. So they talk about that this is really designed to protect women's ability to participate in sport. They specifically talk about Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. And what this law would have done is allow any athlete, parent, or just a community member, right? So you don't have to be related to a student in the school to complain about unfair competition. And then that would have resulted in a physical examination of the student that was being complained about. So they were going to make kids drop their pants and have a physical examination to prove that they were not transgender. The bill passed. They started creating similar bills with virtually identical language. So here in Pennsylvania, we have that same thing going on right now. With a bill that is virtually the same. It's actually been introduced or passed in 38 states. They have some very high profile supporters. Most famous is Martina Navratilova, it's really interesting that she is supporting this legislation as a member of the LGBTQ community. And this bill and many others, again, they have this private right to action where any citizen can sue and effectively put a bounty on a trans kid's head. The good news is that the ACLU sued and they forestalled the law. It is on hold, and it was a Trump-appointed judge that killed this law, right? And they did it based on the right to privacy. They did it based on the right to privacy. Then we get to 2021, so just last year, and Tennessee just took the cake. Right? So they introduced what's called the Slate of Hate. It was a series of 5 bills that target transgender people. The first one banned affirming health care for transgender youth. This was a test case from the ADF. Another one required businesses to post a sign that you see here listed on the screen. So if you were going into a restaurant and that restaurant would allow a transgender woman to use the ladies' room or a trans man to use the men's room, they would have to put up this sign on the front door going into the restaurant. They had a trans sports ban, like we just talked about. They put in an anti-LGBTQ education bill, so the precursor of Don't Say Gay. And then they also put in a specific school and locker room ban. So they started bringing this stuff back, right? But they start off with the sports bills. Similar slates of bills have been introduced in Texas and Arkansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, and Arizona. They're the real baddies in this thing. The bills almost always have similar language, and they are really focusing on this message of fairness. It's not fair to other students. They talk a lot about traditional values, not so much about religious freedom, although that is the code for religious freedom, but they talk about traditional values. And they often talk about we need to protect our children and we need to protect our women, right? And this is where this language about grooming starts coming through, right? So this language of grooming that's been around since the 70s, and really even earlier than that, is really making a big comeback right now. So in 2022, the effort is really expanded. So Arizona, Iowa, Tennessee, we just mentioned, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, and Oklahoma. These are the ones that have really introduced a ton of anti-LGBTQ and specifically anti-trans bills. But we need to, again, keep in mind that this isn't just about LGBTQ issues. This is about misogyny, it's about race, it's about immigration, and frankly, it's about white Christian grievance. That they are this white Christian nationalist sort of viewpoint or worldview that is really creating this problem. I want to mention Texas for a second, because Texas is a special case. So Texas, they introduced all of these bills. Almost all of them were defeated. They were defeated or pulled off of the floor in the legislature. So in Texas, they started taking a different tack, right? So in Texas, Governor Abbott, Attorney General Paxton, they have started taking executive action. So they're just bypassing the legislature. And this includes things like we've heard about investigating the parents of kids who are getting trans-affirming medical assistance, and banning medical care for transgender youth. So the biggest program in the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Texas that supported transgender youth shut its doors just a few weeks ago because they have now this ban from executive action. So they've just decided to go around the legislature. And by the way, other states, in particular Florida, has started to take note of this. And Florida is following the same route. So if they can't get it through the legislature, they will do it by executive action. I'll talk just a little bit about Pennsylvania because I know many of the people here on this in the seminar tonight are from Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, there have been 4 bills introduced. So the first one is HB 972, which was the so-called Fairness in Women's Sports Act. So this passed this past June through the state legislature, first in the House and then in the Senate, and it was recently vetoed by Governor Wolf, thankfully. But there's a companion bill, SB 1191, that started in the Senate. It's called the Protecting Women's Sports Act. It is virtually word for word identical to HB 972. It passed through the Education Committee in the Senate in June, and luckily it hasn't moved at all yet, but it could be reactivated at any time. So one of the things that our organization and many of the others are doing is that we're really talking to Senate leadership, that includes Republicans, about do you really want to bring this thing to the floor? Do you really want to bring it to a debate in the Education Committee? Because it's just going to embarrass you if you do, right? But it could be reactivated really at any time, and then it'll move very quickly to the House where it's sure to get a very quick vote. So that's one that is still pending that we want to make sure that everybody's aware of. Then there's SB 1277 and SB 1278. These are companion bills that effectively are the same thing as the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. So the Parental Control of Student Exposure to Sexually Explicit Content Schools Act, which is a mouthful, it has passed the Senate. And it is now moved over to the House. It's in the Education Committee. Right now, the House is in recess in Pennsylvania, but we would expect that this bill to be taken up by the Education Committee very quickly because it's an election year. And the same thing with the Empowering Families and Education Act. So this is really the core of the Don't Say Gay bill. This is the one that would say that teachers and staff really cannot talk about LGBTQ issues or do any type of education around LGBTQ issues, or really have any kind of real speech around LGBTQ issues in school, all the way through grade 5. To kind of give you a comparison, the Florida bill went through grade 3. So this bill is actually tougher than the Florida bill. And then after grade 5, so grades 6 through 12, what it says is that it has to be appropriate education. Of course, they don't define what appropriate is. And these bills also have that right of private action passage in them. So anybody who feels that something is going on in the school that they don't like, they can sue that school district and get a financial penalty. And the result would be that these schools are simply going to pull the books from the library. It's already happening in some districts. They are simply going to stop doing any type of education around LGBTQ issues. And in some cases, they are likely to stop supporting gender and sexuality alliances, the GSA clubs in support of LGBTQ students, because they are afraid of getting sued. So it has this chilling effect. So these two bills have passed the Senate, and they're waiting in the House to be taken up. And we expect them to be taken up pretty quickly here once they come back into session in September. On the other hand, the Removing Homosexuality from the Crimes Code Act, which Pennsylvania, despite the fact that nationally, the Supreme Court said that quote unquote sodomy is not illegal anymore. They made that ruling back in the 70s. But they said that it has never been pulled from the state's statutes. And so just a couple of weeks ago, one of the last things they did before they went into recess is that HB 2125, after many years, finally passed, and it passed unanimously, right? So it passed unanimously. So it's important to remember that victories can still happen. Today, we had a small victory where Governor Wolf did executive action encouraging state agencies to make sure that their constituencies, Department of Education, Department of Health, aren't supporting any type of actions around conversion therapy. So victories can still happen. We just need to make sure that we are engineering those to happen, and we need to talk about them, frankly. All right, so let's get back to messaging a little bit here as we start to begin to talk about legislation. So the messaging that comes from whether it's the APP, the ADF, the Heritage Foundation, what they're saying is that they're focusing on fairness for women, that women need to be protected from men. They talk a lot about protecting children, right? That children can't make decisions on their own, and that many adults, specifically LGBTQ adults, enable them and are abusers and groomers. So again, this thing about protecting the women and the children, right? And then they talk a lot about traditional values, which is code, of course, for Christian values, right? And it's all about protecting society from evil and avoiding anarchy and the downfall of society. All of these messages are rooted in the 19th century and in Jim Crow, but they really are powerful, and they resonate with this evangelical white base, who, remember, are very, very important voting bloc. They have some real rules. And so these rules came from Meg Kilcannon from the Family Research Council. This is publicly available information. It's on the internet. It's on YouTube, where she is recorded at the 2017 Value Voters Summit when they were gearing up for these efforts. And this is her rules that she gave to these folks around how to deal with it. First thing is that we focus on gender identity because they believe that the T can be broken away from the LGB, that a large portion of the LGB community really doesn't care about the trans community. And so they're they want to kind of break us apart and break the alliance that we've had really, frankly, since the beginning of the movement back in 1960s. Their next one is that you never do any personal or ad hominem attacks, right? So if you attack trans people, if they came out and said like, oh, that Corinne Goodwin is an evil, evil human being, right? It proves that discrimination is a real thing. So we don't do that, right? Instead, what they want to do is they want to use these other arguments around protecting women and children, right? Because they don't want to prove that they really are discriminatory. And then the other thing they said is, don't talk about religion, talk about feminism. So they're trying to rebrand and turn feminism around, right? That women need to be protected, right? And that gender identity and the trans women in particular, that our identities are misogynistic and they erase cisgender women. So it gets back to this, protect the women and protect the kids kind of thing. So what are the takeaways, right? What are the things that we learned, right? First is that the anti-LGBTQ movement is really, really deeply rooted in the Christian evangelical movement. That the Republican Party in particular, but some Democrats also really depend very heavily on evangelical voters. Remember, they account for 15% or so of the electorate, but they vote. They're 28% of, they're 15% of the population, 28% of the electorate, and 75% of them vote Republican. They are highly, highly organized. So they've been working on this, frankly, for decades, right? They've been working on it for decades, and they are very well funded when you look at organizations like Heritage and the Cato Institute and the Koch brothers, right? They are in it for the long term, and they've been very, very methodical in the way that they have tested and refined their messaging. So they've done a lot of market testing on this stuff. Think about that example in Tennessee, where they know what works. They know what buttons to push. And then this idea of protecting the women and children. So the thing that I would say to you as we start to move into the second part of what I'm going to talk about tonight is that LGBTQ activists and LGBTQ allies, we need to have the same level of commitment, as our opponents do. So, quick review of the facts, right? Trans athletes across the country, for example, in Pennsylvania, out of 6.8 million kids who are participating in school sports in states where there are inclusive public school policies for trans athletes, there have only been 4 cited cases where a trans athlete was dominant in K through 12 education. 4 out of 6.8 million. That is 0.00006%. It is a problem that doesn't exist. And the second thing that I really want to call out is around trans athlete bills, is that these laws actually hurt women. So if we think about Brittany Griner, who is in the news right now for incarceration in Russia, but she is a 6'8" tall woman. She has a slim build and she can dunk. And if any parent thought, that their kid in high school or in college was going up against a 6'8" tall woman, Black woman who can dunk, they could be very easily accuse that person of being transgender and then sue that school. That tall, muscular woman, that great athlete, would then be subjected to medical testing and invasive examinations. So it's important to remember that these bills actually, they don't just hurt trans women, they're actually going to hurt a lot more cisgender women. Medical bans. So something that we need to be thinking about here is that, we can talk about till we're blue in the face that, most young people, they don't get their affirming medical care until they hit well into puberty. Surgeries, for example, they almost never are done on anybody who's over 16 years of age. That things like puberty blockers have been used for decades for other conditions other than treating gender dysphoria. And we can talk about that the AMA and the American Academy of Pediatrics and other organizations have been very supportive of affirming care. But the message that really resonates is that when you put this type of law into effect, it discourages doctors from practicing in these states. And many of these states are rural in nature. So Alabama and Tennessee and Kentucky and Iowa, they already have a shortage of doctors. So the story that's going to resonate with a legislator is not going to be this whole thing around protecting trans kids. It's about that you're hurting the rest of your voting bloc, the rest of your population. And by the way, that same thing's happening with abortion right now. And then, educational restrictions and religious exemptions. So it's very important to know that these types of laws, they actually break the law and they break the intent from the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, right? So they encourage really, really broad interpretations of religious liberty. And the message that you want to kind of talk about is this idea of a slippery slope, right? So what is, if we allow them to not do trans kids, or we don't allow them to provide abortions, or we don't, what is the next thing? What's the next thing that's going to happen here, right? Are we not going to allow adoptions? Are we not going to allow teachers to teach? Are we not going to allow mental health providers to provide care, right? So the message really is we can talk about, oh, this stuff is wrong, but we really want to talk about the practical impacts of these things when we're lobbying to our legislators. One more kind of piece of facts. So this is our interpretation of the facts from our side, but Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and in the Bostock ruling, the Supreme Court affirmed this. They said that for the purpose of the Civil Rights Act, that gender identity falls under sex, and the term sex, it's used in that law. So we believe that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act protects transgender people from discrimination. Same thing with Title IX. The education amendments put forth in 1972 and passed in 72 and signed by President Nixon of all people, there is case law that shows that they support transgender rights. And then you have court decisions, the US Third Circuit, the Seventh Circuit, the Sixth Circuit, as well as the Supreme Court have all come out, and there is legal precedent to support the rights of transgender people. And then, of course, there's the big one, which is the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, right? The challenge is that this is all either administrative law or it is case law. There is no actual written law or ordinance at the national level that protects transgender people. That's what the Equality Act would do. So if you're an equality voter, make sure that you're really focusing hard around the Equality Act and talking to your legislatures and your senators about this. If you're in Pennsylvania, talk to Senator Toomey, please. Okay, so now that we talked about facts really briefly, I want you to know that facts don't work. So you can go in and talk to legislators till you're blue in the face. If they are people in particular on the right, they are out in favor of these laws, they have a publicly stated position in favor of these laws, or maybe they're moderates and they're just not too sure. If you quote these facts first, you're going to lose them. The thing that works is storytelling. So when I go in and I lobby, I bring out on my phone a picture of some of the trans youth who we've helped through our programming over the last few years, and we tell their stories. We try to bring a trans kid into us as we lobby. We might bring a doctor with us if we're talking about medical care, or frankly, if we're talking about the athletic bands, right? Who can kind of really talk about and tell a story, and you bring somebody in, right? So one of the things we're going to do in a future session is we're really going to talk about how do you tell stories as part of your lobbying effort. So remember, you need to know your facts. Facts are just to back up your case. You got to have a compelling story. So let's just talk about how we fight back a little bit. So there's three groups we need to really be thinking about. On the left of the screen, we have our supporters, right? So these are the people that are already supporting LGBTQ people. This is about, depending on how you look at it, between 40 and 60% of the population, right? And then you have the opponents on the other side. And again, it's that 40%, sometimes up to 60% if you focus on a single issue, who are opponents. But what we need to be talking to long-term when it comes to election politics is what we call the movable middle, right? So these are the swing voters, and we need them to move over to our side, right? This is that 3%, 3 to 7% of the electorate that, we need them to become equality voters. And we need them to vote in every single election, not just the presidential, right? But the off-year elections, the local elections, they need to vote in every election at every single level. So, one of the messages I want to make sure that we get across tonight is this idea that, school board elections matter. Showing up and speaking to our school boards matter. Showing up at our county council or county legislator or our city council meetings is critical, right? That old saying about all politics is local really is an important one to remember. So from election politics, as we head into an election cycle here this fall, we need to be really trying to figuring out how do we message and move these middle voters? And what I'll say is these voters are your neighbors, right? They're the people that you work with every day. They're the people that you see at the grocery store every day. So we need to be thinking about how do we make sure that we are able to move these people in the middle over to the side of equality and how to get them energized to vote. Now let's talk a little bit, and like I said, this is really the long game, even though we're in an election cycle. One of the things that the Republicans and the ADF and the APP and these other organizations, Heritage, know is that, if you think about it, they've been playing the long game forever, right? It goes back to the Tea Party movement and even before that. They've been fighting the long game in local politics forever. We need to have that same level of commitment. So let's talk about the shorter term game, right? So if you think about what the legislative process is, and every state obviously is a little bit different, but generally speaking, there are a lot of places where we can either bury a bill, amend a bill, or outright defeat a bill. And many people think of the legislative process as this sort of black and white thing, right? The bill either passes or the bill either fails. And I'll use HB 972, the Pennsylvania sports bill, as an example. That bill we had it buried and not moving out of committee for a year and a half. The thing that made it move, frankly, is when we had an NCAA swimmer have a big victory and reach a podium, right? So Leah Thomas got out there and had a great victory, and we really want to recognize her for that great accomplishment. But that took that bill that we had buried and it kind of brought it out to top of mind for the public, and that brings it out to top of mind for the legislators. But we had that thing successfully killed for a long time. So let's kind of talk about how that works. So the first place that you really have a good opportunity to kill a bill is during what's called co-sponsorship. So this is before the bill is formally introduced. So what will happen is a legislator will say, I want to introduce a bill, and they're going to send a memo out to their other legislators in the House or in the Senate and the legislator, and they will say, hey, I want to put together a bill that says that trans kids can't play sports. And these memos are usually only a paragraph or two long. They don't have a whole lot of detail, right? What they're trying to do is test the waters to see if they can get enough people on board to make this thing worth the effort of actually writing the bill. What we want to try to do when it's in this co-sponsorship stage is a couple things, right? We want to try to lobby and talk to our legislators enough. If we can get them just to say that, nope, I'm not going to support this bill, it'll die on the vine it'll die before it ever even grows from seed. The other thing that we can do is we can modify content, right? And I'm going to give you an example of that here in the next stage, is where we were able to modify some content successfully here just a few weeks ago. But before that bill is ever filed, there is an opportunity to kill it, to delay it, to make it go away. The next place is after it's introduced. So what happens when a bill comes in, it's introduced into, for example, the Pennsylvania House, and then it is referred to committee. In the case of the sports bills, and the Don't Say Gay bills are usually going to an education committee. So we have the opportunity, through testimony and through lobbying to potentially just outright defeat that bill, right? So they would defeat it, 10 votes against the bill, 9 votes for the bill. In most state legislatures, though, that is very hard to do. And the reason is for example, in the state legislature here in Pennsylvania, the Republicans make sure that they have twice as many Republicans on the committee as they have Democrats. So even if they lose 1 or 2 Republicans, it's going to go through. And by the way, if the Democrats had control of the House, they would do the exact same thing, right? So this is an issue with our electoral politics on both sides of the aisle. It's the same thing with gerrymandering, right? So there is the opportunity to outright defeat a bill in committee, but it's really hard to do. What is less hard to do and is what we had done, for example, with HB 972, was to delay it or to remove it from the schedule. So the chairman of these committees, the chair people of these committees are really, really powerful. And they have the ability to say, yeah, I'm going to put this bill on the schedule for consideration in the committee, or no, I'm just not going to move it. An example of that is the Pennsylvania Fairness Act, which is the Pennsylvania equivalent of the Equality Act at the federal level. This bill has been introduced for now 15 years straight, and it has never, ever made it out of committee. And the reason it's never made it out of committee is because the committee leadership and the Republican-controlled House has decided that they don't even want to talk about it. So we have the opportunity to talk to the committee chair, the committee leadership, and the House leadership, and the Senate leadership, and say, like, don't you really want to be working on something else? Do you really think that this is what you want to be spending your time on? Let's have a conversation. And often what happens is we're able to make these bills go away. And if you make the bill go away for 2 years, then the bill dies, and then it would have to be reintroduced in a new bill. So, this kind of delay tactic can often be highly successful if we get it removed from the schedule. And then, of course, the other opportunity is to modify content. And an example of that actually happened very recently with SB 1277, which is the bill that would require libraries to remove books and other instructional materials in schools based on objection from parents. That bill specifically called out homosexuality as one of the categories that would require librarians to pull those materials from the schools. We were able to get an amendment introduced that pulled the language specifically talking about homosexuality out of that bill. And that might feel like a really minor thing because the bill passed the Senate, but it's a thing. And sometimes, right, little word changes in a bill can make a big difference. I'll give you another example that actually today in the governor's executive order talking about conversion therapy, he didn't come right out and ban conversion therapy. He didn't say that state Medicaid can not pay for conversion therapy. What he said is that they're supposed to make efforts at making sure that doesn't happen. That's a pretty substantive change, right? We would have liked to have an outright ban, but he didn't feel he could go there. Well, if you kind of reverse that, that's what we did with 1277 is we were able to get some verbiage changes that made it so it doesn't directly impact LGBTQ people. It still could, but it doesn't directly impact us. So that was a small victory, and we'll take it because it was probably at the time the best that we can get. The next place that you can kill a bill is before what's called consideration. So in many legislatures, Pennsylvania is an example, bills actually get considered 3 times. So there's a vote so it goes through committee, then it's voted on a first consideration. A day or 2 later, they bring it back, they vote it on again. A day or 2 later, they bring it back and they vote on it again. At each one of those opportunities, there's an opportunity to delay. And at each one of those opportunities, there is an opportunity to amend. So for example, around the sports bills, we have an amendment out there right now that would get rid of that right to private action as an example. We have another amendment that speaks to the whole, specifically speaks to the issue of physical examinations, right? So there are ways to weaken legislation as well as, of course, to outright defeat it. After that, it gets voted on the floor. Usually when bills get to the floor, unless it is a vote meant just for show, those votes will almost always get put through. Then it goes back and the process repeats in the other chambers. So if the bill starts in the House, it'll go over to the Senate, and this whole opportunity happens again. So in the Senate, back this up. So, it goes through the House, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then it goes back in the Senate, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And again, we have opportunities in every one of these things to try to kill or modify or delay or outright defeat a bill. Then, of course, if the bill goes through, then the governor has to take action. And for example, on the sports bill, Governor Wolf here in Pennsylvania, as did the governor, for example, in Utah on their sports bill, vetoed those sports bills, right? So by lobbying or electing a governor who supports LGBTQ people, you can prevent a bill from going through, as long as you have a veto-proof minority for that bill. Luckily, we do right now. Okay, so this is kind of the process. And so organizations like ours, or the Pennsylvania Youth Congress, or ACLU, we all work really feverishly, often behind the scenes, kind of having these quiet conversations around, filing co-sponsorship or in committee or things like that. Lots of conversations that you don't see publicly on TV, right? Because we know that by the time it makes it on TV, it's probably too late to do anything about it. So this is the short game. It's just as critical. We have to play both the long-term political election game. We also have to play this sort of step-by-step, bill-by-bill game in the state house, or for that matter, in county and city legislatures. One thing that you can do, and I'll put it in the chat here in a bit, is you can subscribe to legislative alerts. So I get, for example, an email every single day saying what co-sponsorship memos have gone out in the Pennsylvania State House, as well as anything that's happened, so I can see if a bill's starting to move or not. And then I get together with other organization leaders to try to resolve these issues. So if you want to subscribe to the legislative alert, we'll put that into the chat a little bit later, or you can send an email to us at info@patransequity.org. We'll show you how to do it. So fighting back, right? Now that we know how the process works, the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we are utilizing all of our media, right? And it starts with stories. Moms and kids are the most powerful things out there, right? So we want to make sure that we're talking about moms and kids. I show people the pictures on my phone. I try to bring a mom or a kid with me. I was meeting with a legislator the other day, and they were saying that, well, can you bring in a kid to talk to us? Because, you're a talking head, Corinne, right? And so these things are really important. And remember this idea of, we can have facts and fact sheets till we're blue in the face. It's the stories that get told that make the difference. And we can tell those stories everywhere, right? We can tell them in the newspaper and on TV and social media and on radio and magazines and podcasts. So get our stories out there. The next thing we have to do is we have to network. We think back to HB2. What really defeated HB2 was when all of the corporations said that they were pulling their business from North Carolina, because that hit the North Carolina economy and that hit people where they live, which is in their pocketbook, right? And so, you network with corporations. If you can get the head of a corporation, a local employer, to reach out to a legislator, that'll make a difference, right? Not just LGBTQ nonprofits, but other organizations and churches and synagogues and the Chamber of Commerce, right? All of these organizations, this, connections and money really do make the world go round. And so we were able to defeat a piece in a local county here a year or so ago because we we were able to utilize this network of community organizers and organizations in Northampton County to get a bill pulled from the table. Show up. So visibility is really critical. You have to feel comfortable enough to leave your safe zone, right? And I will tell you that school board meetings right now are where it's at. So there are school boards all around the state of Pennsylvania. In particular, Lancaster County is a hot spot, and the Conestoga School District and the Hempfield School District, but also in Bucks County and other places here in our state and in all states where school boards, whether it is talking about critical race theory, which of course isn't really a thing, or LGBTQ access, or libraries, or book bans, we need to show up and we need to show out because our opponents show up and show out every single meeting. We need to do the same. We need to get to know our leaders personally. So, I was just at an event today and I saw two state legislators, and I saw the mayor of Allentown, and, I know everybody by their first name and they know me, right? And so just, getting to know them personally, they get your contact information. If they have a question, you're now there as a resource for them, right? They can say, oh, I know a transgender person, I know a queer person, and then that can really make a difference. Letters and emails are really important. And I want to talk about social media for a minute here. So bitching about on social media doesn't get anything done. Doesn't do anything other than make you feel better about yourself for a short time. And that's because of the algorithm. The algorithm makes it so that you're really just talking to the people who likely already believe in what you're saying. What you need to do is you need to send emails and letters to your local legislators as a constituent, right? This legislator that I was meeting with a couple of weeks ago, they said, yeah, they literally said, we laugh at the social media comments because our polling shows is that those people don't vote. So really important that you write letters, snail mail letters, or a direct email to your individual legislator, right? And then be sure also, by the way, to comment on rules and regulations. So right now, the U.S. Department of Health and the U.S. Department of Education both have comment periods going on 2 rules that would go into effect that would support LGBTQ people. They need to hear from you too. And if you go to our social media, you'll see links where you can make those comments. Lobbying, and we're going to talk more about this in our next session, specifically in how you do it. But we need to remember that we need to work with legislators in both parties. So legislatures tend to be really, really either heavily Democratic, if you're in Maryland, for example, or really heavily Republican, for example, in Pennsylvania or in Texas. And so that forces us to have conversations with people of parties that we don't necessarily agree with, right? The people we target are the moderates. So, we're never going to convince the hard right people to vote our way, but there are many people that are in these kind of swing districts that will listen to us. They will take our meeting. They will at least consider what we have to say, which is really important. And by the way, as a constituent, you will always get a meeting with your legislator, even if they know that you have an opposing viewpoint. They have to talk to you. They have to talk to you by law, okay? When you go in, make sure that you spend time listening. The last thing they want to do is be lectured like I am doing to you right now. Using the stories, facts are really there for a backup, okay? And the last thing I'll say in this is that it's important to remember that politicians are followers. They're not leaders. So they always demand respect. And they need it because if we go in and we disrespect them, we're going to lose any opportunity we have to create influence. Just some things for talking points if you are talking to a conservative legislator. Talk about things like government intrusion, right? So this is that slippery slope idea of, all right, so we do bodily inspections for transgender people, and that can impact women of color, and then that could impact, white women. Oh my God, what are we going to do, right? So this idea of the slippery slope and invasion of privacy, right? You can talk about that local officials know what's best. So, allow the people in the local community to make decisions. Don't legislate from on high, right? And then this idea of unintended consequences, right? So for example, medical providers could leave the area, or cisgender girls could be targeted. What we want to do is make sure that we're giving them the talking points that they need to talk to the ADF and tell them why they're not going to do what they want. Other things is that, for example, there are more important issues around women's equity in sport, for example. Fully funding coaches and fully funding facilities. And there's lots of other ways to help women in sport, right? Listening to the experts, right? So whether it's the AMA or the Endocrine Society, there are experts out there. We can try to bring those people with us. And then we can talk about constitutionality and how courts, including Trump-appointed judges, have said that anti-trans legislation is unconstitutional. And then the other thing I'll just say is that you need to remember you're selling. And great salespeople spend a lot of time listening. We listen for what their needs are. Then we try to offer them a solution. If they provide an objection, we try to answer that objection. Always be polite. Always give them your name and your information so they can try to reach back out, and always follow up. While you're working with politicians, you can also work against them, right? So you may have a state legislator or a county legislator in your area who you don't agree with. You can still have a conversation with them and then work against them at the same time. That's what elections are all about, right? And there's lots of ways to do it. So, I'll talk about mobilizing voters. So we're in this election season, and my congressperson personally called me the other day and said, "Hey, Corinne, would you get on the phone and, and do some work, calling voters?" And I said, no. I said no because I get misgendered all the time when I call people on the phone. It's very triggering. But I said I would go out and knock doors, or I would do a mass text campaign for her, right? So, based on your comfort level, you can find the right thing that you need to do, right? Contribute financially if you can, or with labor. Like I said, door knocking. You can write letters to the editor saying, I support this candidate because of X, Y, Z. You can encourage your friends and family to vote and explain why it's important, right? And remember, keep your focus local too, right? Because school board directors become city council people, and city council people become state legislators, and state legislators become Congress people, right? We want to play that long game. Something else that you can do is, if you're not sure, is that you can check out people's voting records. The ACLU has a really good tool for evaluating the voting records of legislators based on what the ACLU cares about, obviously, but it's still a really good tool. So with that, I want to leave you with a few kind of final things, and then we can have people raise their hands and put questions in the chat, hopefully. Our next session is on the 20th, and it's going to really talk about, now that we sort of laid some groundwork, what are the specific things that you can do to become an advocate? How do you become a good communicator? The things, whether you're in the closet or out of the closet, or ambitious or maybe not quite so ambitious, what are the things that you can do to make a difference? So that's on the 20th. And then just some other kind of final thoughts. So we know that these bills are all about activating crossover and women voters, right? We need to, the message from the right is, we need to protect women and children. Well, they are doing that so they get the rest of their agenda, whether it's tax policy or deregulation or environmental or gun rights or, anti-union or whatever it is. This is why they are pushing these bills, to activate voters so they can do these other things. As you're having a conversation with people about the anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ legislation, ask about if they care about these other things as well. Because if the legislator is talking only about transgender stuff, what is their hidden agenda? That's where finding out about their voting record, for example, can be really helpful as you're having discussions with friends and relatives about voting. Keep in mind, right? So we're winning, even right now, we're winning 85% of the time. We'd love to win 100% of the time, but we're defeating these bills or getting them stalled 85% of the time. And that is a really, really good batting average, right? Our actions make a difference every single day, every single day. And then the last thing that I'll just remind you of is it's not 1972. So I have a good friend who medically transitioned in 1972. I don't know how you do that, but she figured out a way pre-internet. She found the only surgeon on the East Coast that would do surgery. She found the only doctor in the state of Pennsylvania that would provide hormone therapy, right? And she was arrested numerous times just for wearing feminine clothing out in public as a person who was assigned male at birth. We are not there. We're not there, right? We have made a ton of progress. But right now, we really are in this moment where we're kind of hanging on by our fingernails, right? And small victories count because we don't want to backslide. And that's why, I'm asking you, our board members are asking you, our community is asking you to become active, right? To become that advocate. And we want to help you to become that advocate.